I got to tell you, sometimes I feel like I just don't belong here.
Here in
I'm going to
this
be honest.
here in this podcast?
In this podcast, in this chair, sitting across from you, having this conversation, just feel like I don't. How did I get here? Why am I here? Do I belong here? Do I deserve to be here? Do I have value to share? Having one of those days,
So today on Consulting Mastery, an existential crisis.
So not actually, to be honest. However, I am satirically pointing at a syndrome that consultants of all stripes, including myself, struggle with in certain seasons, in certain contexts, and that's what we know as imposter syndrome. Certainly something that I've struggled with, and again, not today necessarily, despite my introduction, but definitely there's been seasons in business, and there's been circumstances where it's bubbled up and made me question a lot of things and made me feel uncomfortable and out of my element and all those things that, if you're listening, you probably can identify with. And the reason why we wanted to bring this up today is because as a consultant, this can be consequential. If your imposter syndrome is not managed effectively, it's not under control, you don't have a handle on it, it can be quite consequential. We wanted to dig into that today.
Yes, and I think, to your earlier point, when you said it's probably something that everyone who's listening can relate to, let's first of all normalize it, right? Imposter syndrome is something that, every self-aware human probably goes through at some point or other in their life. And I say it's self-aware because the reality is if you're not self-aware and you walk through the world, just believing that you're good at everything and belong in every room all the time, that's probably a lovely place to live, but it likely means you're missing something, right? And so I think first let's normalize it, because often it can feel like you're the only one, right? Everyone else is out there being confident. Everyone else is out there with exactly what they need to know in any given moment. And I'm the only dum-dum who, who's feeling lost or unsure or doesn't feel like I, have the authority to have this conversation today. And the reason I think it's important to normalize it is just like anything else. Once you normalize it, you can sort of more objectively look at it and deal with it. You can shrink it to, a more appropriate level in terms of how much of your headspace it's taking over at any given moment.
Actually, what's really interesting here is at one point it was believed that only people like you, Carrie, experience imposter syndrome.
People like me.
So the term imposter syndrome was coined in 1978 by a couple of psychologists named Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes. And they were studying a very specific population that was high achieving women who had ascended the success ladder, so to speak, and were objectively accomplished in their careers. And despite evidence of those accomplishments and that ascension, they persisted in the belief that their success was luck. Mm-hmm. It was a fluke. Like it wasn't them. It just happened to them. It was the circumstances, so to speak. And that eventually they would be exposed for the imposters that they truly are. And that's initially where this term came from. Now, since then, there's been many studies that have shown that actually it's not unique to these high achieving women, that it exists across gender, seniority, industry, culture, context, not just professional, etc. And in fact, a 2011 study found that roughly 70% of people experience some level of imposter syndrome at some point in their lives. And so, to your point, I think this is something that holds people back quite a bit, and I want to dig into, why and what to do about it today. However, normalizing it is important, because if you're feeling this way, and we typically find this to be more pronounced in a transitionary period where, for example, a lot of our clients are, either new consultants who are transitioning into consulting, or they're consultants who have been kind of stuck at a bit of a revenue plateau or a status quo kind of phase in their business. They're trying to break out of that through that plateau and out of the status quo. And both examples represent changing dynamics, changing circumstances, changing clients, offers, price points, value, etc. Right? And we tend to find that the imposter syndrome is most pronounced in those transitionary periods where you're going from one level to the next level. So I think it's worth calling out that, it's in many ways, imposter syndrome is a sign that you're pushing the boundaries of what you're capable of, or at least what you believe you're capable of. Because if you were squarely operating within your comfort zone, right? If you continue to operate at a level that you're comfortable with, you continue to do things that you're comfortable with, you continue to engage the familiar, probably not going to feel much imposter syndrome, right? It comes up when you're pushing those boundaries, and that's where growth lives. So, at one level, I think, let's normalize it, and also let's call it that's not a bad thing necessarily. It means that you're probably, pushing the boundaries on what you believe you're capable of, and therefore growing through it.
Yeah, and I agree 100%. And I think the important thing for us to talk about today, because the thing that's going to be most useful, I would presume, for the folks who are listening, is how it affects the world around you. Because it's one thing to feel a certain way on the inside, right? To know that you're kind of struggling with this, and maybe that's inconvenient, and maybe it's uncomfortable, and maybe it just doesn't feel great on a day-to-day basis. But the real challenge here is not that. The real challenge is what you living through your imposter syndrome or struggling with your imposter syndrome in any given moment projects out to the world. And that is arguably more important in the scenarios that we'll talk about today, where you are a consultant, where you're out in the world, sharing your point of view, where you're out in the world, putting yourself out there, right? Exposing yourself. It's probably very different than, and I'm sure they feel this way too, but a scientist working in a lab whose whole job is to be unsure, right? Whose whole job is to, not sort of attach themselves to an opinion or a point of view. As a consultant, that's not your role, right? Your role is to be very clear about what you know, where you can help, and what the value is that you bring. And therefore, what you need to be able to do, and we'll talk about, A, why this is important, and B, how you can do this, is get your imposter syndrome either in check or working for you in a way that doesn't reduce, the perception of the people around you.
Oh, the nature of consulting is there's quite a high degree of interpersonal communication that takes place, right? So you're not the scientist in the lab who maybe has a boss and some some support staff, but otherwise is kind of knee deep in experimentation and test tubes and whatever. I should know that's my father's a scientist, but that's not your reality, right? You're constantly dealing with people. You're dealing with prospects that you have to persuade to work with you if they're a good fit. You're dealing with clients you have to continue to support. You're dealing with team members if you have team members. And so there's all this communication taking place. And I think the thing that people really don't appreciate or don't consider as much as they should is how much of that communication is nonverbal. So you think, well, yeah, I'm not feeling like I belong. I have imposter syndrome, but as long as I say the right things, it's not really going to hurt me. And I won't go too deep into the, to like the psychology of how emotional states transfer, but there's tons of research on this, that when you have a certain emotional state, even if the words don't convey that, your tonality, your body language, your energy, so to speak, does convey that state. So this is why, when you're talking to somebody who's really, really upbeat and happy and feeling very positive, you tend to feel pretty good. And when you're talking to somebody who's like depressed or going through a really hard time and just like really going through it, like, that really brings your mood down, right? And so we've all experienced this practically. And the reason that's significant is because when you get on a sales call, for example, let's use sales as an example of this. Well, think about what happens on a sales call. Your prospect has to make a decision to either work with you or not work with you, buy or not buy, okay? And they're doing their due diligence. They're asking questions, they're doing research, whatever it may be. Now, it is impossible for them to do complete 100% due diligence, right? It's impossible in any transaction. This is not just true for consulting. It's impossible in any transaction to do complete due diligence, in that you cannot be completely certain that it's going to work out. You cannot know everything there is to know about what's going to happen. At some level, every purchase is a leap of faith. Some people like to go further, right, in the due diligence. Some are satisfied with less information. But at some level, when you say, yeah, let's do this thing, it's a leap of faith. You're saying, I have enough information. I don't know everything, but I have enough to say, yeah, let's do it. And in that context, if you show up to that conversation and you're unsure, you're lacking confidence, your imposter syndrome is running amok that day or that week or that month. And sure, you say the right things, but your tone, your posture, your intonation, everything is communicating self-doubt. Not quite sure if I can do this. And those thoughts are coming to mind. Ooh, can I pull that off? That might be too big of a problem. I'm not sure I can work with a client at this level. They feel like they're too big for me. They feel like they're too sophisticated. I don't know if I'm going to be able to as those things come up, they are communicated non-verbally and they project doubt. And the last thing that you want to do in a sales conversation, where at the end of the day, if they're going to buy it, there's going to be a leap of faith that's made, is project doubt.
So now you made it worse for everybody who has imposter syndrome and now realizes that, in fact, they were imposters on their last sales call as well. So let's, not sit in that for too long. Let's talk about how to move past it, to move through it. And what we're not talking about is miraculously just not having imposter syndrome, because I don't think that's realistic or possible necessarily, right? What we're talking about is how can you function in the world in the way that you need to, either in a sales conversation or in a delivery situation, or when you're creating content, right? When you are putting your opinion out in front of the masses. The real question is, okay, I feel this way, and now you're telling me that other people can tell. What do I do?
So I think it's worth talking about, how much is okay and how much is too much, right? This is kind of like cholesterol, right? Like you want to have enough. Like you need cholesterol in your bloodstream. Like that's necessary. If you have low cholesterol, you're gonna have problems, right? I mean, the healthy cholesterol at least, right? That's probably true for both types. No expert here. But if you go above a certain threshold, it becomes problematic. And I think imposter syndrome is very much the same way. Some level is normal, healthy for a functioning adult, right? Some level, you don't want to walk into every conversation with bulletproof confidence, because that might make you negligent. Mm-hmm. That might hinder preparation. Like if you got a call coming up with a prospect, a certain level of self-doubt, if we can call it that, or imposter syndrome, is healthy as long as it encourages the right behaviors. If it encourages preparation, if it encourages research, if it encourages you to do productive things to prepare for the conversation so you can be more effective in the conversation, that's probably healthy. It's probably a good thing. Where it becomes problematic is when it spills over into distortion, where you start to tell yourself stories about, well, yeah, here's a really common one that our clients deal with all the time. That client's too big for me. I've never worked with a company that big. They only work with big firms. And I'm just a solo, or I'm just independent, I'm just a boutique or whatever, right? That's distortion. That's not fact. That doesn't actually produce any kind of productive behavior. It doesn't make you more prepared. It just distorts reality because you're buying into this story that may or may not be true, but you have no evidence for. So I think it's worth noting that, we're not saying, to your point, you should get rid of all self-doubt. No, some forms of self-doubt and, are humility, right? You just don't know everything. And there will be new experiences and new prospects that you deal with and new people that you talk to and new situations that you encounter. And those are learning opportunities where a certain level of self-doubt, imposter syndrome, humility is a feature.
What we're really talking about here is bringing some level of objectivity back into the scenario. Because when you're going down a spiral of imposter syndrome, to your point, it starts to self-amplify, right? Like you start to buy into the story and believe the story, and you do it without thinking about it, which, like in most things in life, is the problem, right? And so, one trick that can be really helpful is just noticing, right? And calling it out. So hold on a minute. I'm feeling really insecure in this moment. Let me just think about it for a minute. Objectively speaking, if I were to ask someone else, right? If I wasn't inside my own head, if I were to ask someone who knows me, who knows my work, would they say that I, in fact, should be really uncomfortable in this moment because, in fact, I am not qualified enough, right? I don't know enough, or I don't have enough experience? Or would they potentially tell me that this is something that's just happening in my head? And, getting outside of your own brain can be really helpful. But even before that, I think the really important thing is just to notice, okay, something's going on, right? I don't quite feel my most confident right now. And if you can just build in that little moment where you check yourself, even that can be enough, in advance of an important conversation, in advance of a particular interaction, to really help you get back into a place where you can come at it. And to your point about, creating good behavior, you can come at it from a point of curiosity, because you often, as well, if you're going into an imposter syndrome spiral, you're jumping to a bunch of conclusions, right? Of course they're too big, so that wouldn't work. Of course they're too sophisticated, so that wouldn't work. The reality is you probably don't even know. And there's some room to ask the questions that will either potentially prove that for you, but more often and more likely will, show you that, in fact, you do have everything that you need to be able to enter into that relationship.
Yeah. Yeah, no, 100%. And I think, ultimately, there's an obvious tension here, right? If you're going to do new things, if you're going to, let's say you're a consultant and, you've been coasting along at, 150, 200K, whatever it may be. And you believe there's another level for you. And that requires working in a different market, different level of client, charging higher price points, higher value offer, whatever it may be. These are all new experiences that you haven't had before, you haven't done before. So you can be forgiven for feeling a little bit out of place when you're exploring that territory. But that doesn't mean that you can't do it, because everything you've done up until now, the first time, you hadn't done it. Right? Like every single thing you've accomplished, there was a starting point. And at some point it became routine and normalized, and it wasn't a big deal anymore. But there was a point in time where it was a big deal and you hadn't done it before and it was your first time. And so there's this interesting research by a psychologist named Albert Bandura on self-efficacy. Because self-efficacy, i.e. the belief that you can succeed in a task, is really kind of the antidote or the cure to imposter syndrome. Like if you believe that, yes, this is new, and yes, I haven't been here before, but I fundamentally believe I can still do it despite all of that, despite its newness, despite its unfamiliarity, despite that I haven't actually accomplished this in the past or worked in this context in the past. I do believe that given my skill set, given my ability, given my expertise, that I can be successful here. Then you can go into those new experiences with level of confidence. And what Bandura articulates as being the single most powerful source of building this self-efficacy muscle is what he calls mastery experiences. Mastery experiences are experiences you've had in the past that provide evidence of your ability to master something new for the first time. So really the solution here is start to journal and reflect on where you've been successful in the past. Because the interesting thing about self-efficacy is it can transfer across domains. If you've done something successfully in one domain, you can borrow the confidence or the self-efficacy from that domain into another. So where have you been successful? Where did you do something new for the first time and felt unsure about it, but still managed to figure it out and work it out and find success? Reflecting on those experiences strengthens your self-efficacy, helps you show up with more confidence on that next sales call.